I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The monarchy had survived scandals, fractures, funerals, and family wars. But this was different. Behind closed palace doors, King Charles III made a declaration so direct that even senior members of the royal household were left stunned. William was being formally named his royal successor. It was not presented as ceremony. It was presented as necessity, and the silence that followed suggested everyone in that room understood something the public had not yet been told. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the words could not be taken back. An emergency royal declaration, an extraordinary formal statement issued by the sovereign when immediate clarity is required, had now placed William, Prince of Wales, at the center of everything that came next. The phrase, royal successor, carried even greater weight inside this dramatized royal crisis. It was not simply another way of saying heir to the throne. Here, it served as a deliberate palace designation meant to tell advisors, family members, and senior officials that William's future authority was no longer something to discuss only in distant terms. His position had suddenly become immediate. The king read the final sentence once. Then he read it again. Charles slowly placed the declaration on the table and said nothing, and that silence carried more emotion than any speech could have managed. Relief sat beside grief. He had strengthened his eldest son's standing, but in doing so, the monarch had also admitted something uncomfortable. His own reign had entered a period where certainty mattered more than appearances. William watched his father closely, searching for some sign that this was merely precaution. Charles gave him none. William did not smile. The prince did not offer thanks. He remained still before finally asking two words that changed the mood in the room completely. Why now? His father looked toward him but did not immediately answer. The future king understood succession, the established process through which the crown eventually passes from one sovereign to the next. But this announcement felt different. It felt accelerated. It felt defensive. Most troubling of all, it felt as though Charles knew something his son did not. Hours earlier, a late-night communication had reached the monarch and triggered the unscheduled gathering. Charles had immediately restricted attendance, calling only a narrow circle into the discussion and accelerating language that had apparently not been intended for immediate release. Whatever that communication contained, it had been serious enough to push the king from preparation into action. Yet when the designation was confirmed, Charles withheld the private reason behind his urgency. That omission followed William out of the meeting. The prince carried a title that sounded like reassurance, but felt increasingly like a warning. And before he could corner his father and demand the truth, word of the declaration reached another member of the family. From that moment, royal successor stopped being merely about constitutional continuity. It became something far more dangerous, a deeply personal judgment on everyone standing closest to the throne. For William, the declaration was not simply an elevation. It was a burden placed directly on his shoulders by his father. For Charles, it was not merely an act of kingship. It was an admission that the future could no longer remain comfortably distant. Yet beyond father and son stood Catherine, Camilla, Harry, and the younger generation, each forced to understand that one sentence had quietly rearranged the emotional balance of the entire royal family. William carried the greatest weight because the decision had changed more than how the palace described him. As Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the monarch's eldest son and immediate heir, he was already expected to prepare for the crown, but preparation had always allowed distance. Charles had spent years giving his son responsibility piece by piece, allowing confidence to grow without making every duty feel like a rehearsal for succession. Now that distance had vanished. By naming him royal successor, the king had turned gradual preparation into an unmistakable transfer of trust, and William understood exactly why that mattered. Catherine, Princess of Wales, found him alone after the meeting, sitting with papers beside him that he had barely touched. She did not ask whether he was proud. She asked whether he was frightened. William hesitated before admitting that the title itself did not trouble him. What unsettled him was his father's urgency. Charles had never prepared him through panic, and the prince could not ignore the possibility that the king believed something was approaching that required the family to be ready sooner than expected. Catherine listened carefully, then asked him to think back over the previous few days. Camilla received the confirmation differently. Queen Camilla had expected William's role to grow with time, but she had not expected a declaration to be finalized before she had been fully brought into the decision. When the queen consort learned how far Charles had already taken the process, her surprise hardened into unease. She was not simply reacting to William's rise. She was reacting to her own absence from the king's decisive inner circle. And that exclusion cut deeper, because Charles had always relied heavily on her private judgment. Harry was given the news through a direct private communication, before the declaration overwhelmed public discussion. Prince Harry understood the significance immediately. His father had deliberately chosen to let him hear the decision through family channels, rather than through a headline. Yet that gesture carried its own painful message. William was being brought closer to the center, while the younger brother was being reminded, quietly but unmistakably, how far that center had moved away from him. William's thoughts then turned to Prince George. His son was still young, but every strengthening of the future king's position also pushed the next generation symbolically closer to responsibility. The declaration, therefore, did not stop with Charles and William. It reached George, too, making the prince realize that his father had not merely clarified one succession. He had tightened the entire chain. Catherine suddenly remembered the detail William had dismissed days earlier, an unusually tense private exchange with Charles that had ended without explanation. She pressed him to reconsider it. The more they reconstructed that moment, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. The declaration had not begun in the emergency meeting at all. Its real origin lay in one private royal incident that transformed Charles's concern into action. Days before the emergency declaration, there had been no dramatic proclamation, no hurried gathering, and no public suggestion that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Then came one private evening at Windsor. A conversation intended to last minutes stretched far longer, ending with Charles alone, William disturbed, and a senior aide ordered to prepare material nobody expected to need. That night became the hidden turning point, the moment the king decided uncertainty itself had become a threat. Charles had already been carrying questions he could no longer push aside. The monarch's workload, the pressure of royal duties, and the need for continuity had all begun forcing one uncomfortable calculation. How much responsibility should William carry if his father suddenly needed to step back? Continuity, in royal terms, simply means keeping the monarchy functioning without confusion when circumstances change. Until that evening, the king had resisted language that might make his son appear prematurely activated. Charles believed gradual preparation protected William from appearing impatient and protected the crown from looking unstable. The private discussion at Windsor changed everything. 3 nights before the declaration, Charles turned to William and asked whether he would be ready to take complete command of royal responsibilities without warning. The prince answered yes, but the question unsettled him immediately. He asked why such a scenario suddenly needed to be discussed. His father did not explain. Charles moved away, placed the briefing file he had been holding onto a nearby surface, and said only, "I need certainty." The words were quiet, but William heard something final inside them. William left carrying more fear than information. Later that evening, Catherine, Princess of Wales, listened as he described the exchange and admitted It had not felt like an ordinary conversation about preparation. The prince told her it felt more personal, almost as though Charles were trying to make certain his family could survive a difficult moment before that moment arrived. Catherine did not dismiss the feeling. She reminded him that his father had spent years avoiding sudden transitions, which made the abrupt question even more disturbing. William knew she was right, and that realization deepened the unease he had brought home. Charles acted before the night was over. The king summoned a trusted advisor and instructed that draft language be prepared for a new royal successor designation, a formal palace label, within this dramatized account, intended to make William's future authority unmistakably clear. A documented account of that private instruction later established the sequence. First came the Windsor conversation, then the draft, then the emergency declaration. The connection was no longer a matter of interpretation. That conversation had been the trigger. Camilla soon learned enough to understand the timing. Queen Camilla discovered that Charles had reached his decision only after speaking privately with William, and her reaction was immediate. She wanted to know why she had not been present, why the king had moved so quickly, and why such a major decision had advanced without her full involvement. The unanswered question William carried away from Windsor had now become hers as well. And when the queen consort finally confronted Charles directly, the restraint holding the royal household together began to crack. The confrontation did not happen before advisors, courtiers, or cameras. It happened privately, where titles offered no protection. Camilla wanted one answer. Why had Charles taken one of the most consequential decisions of his reign without first bringing her fully into his confidence? The king's response was measured, but devastating, because this was no longer a disagreement over protocol. It was a husband defending a decision that his wife feared had changed her place beside him. Camilla entered the conversation already knowing more than Charles expected. She had learned that the declaration had been drafted almost immediately after his private Windsor exchange with William, which meant the decision had advanced far beyond a passing discussion before she was fully brought into it. The queen consort understood what that could mean. A strengthened role for William could change who received information first, who influenced future decisions, and how power moved through the royal household long before any actual succession. For her, this was not theory. It touched the balance of the reign itself. Charles remained still when she asked the question directly. Queen Camilla wanted to know whether he no longer trusted her judgment. The king did not answer at once. He let the silence stretch, then told her the declaration had never been designed to diminish her. It was meant to protect the crown. In royal terms, the crown meant more than the physical symbol worn at ceremonies. It represented the continuing authority and institution of the monarchy itself. Charles believed he had acted to preserve that continuity. Camilla heard the explanation, but it did not calm her. The queen consort pressed harder. If this was truly about protecting the future, why had she been excluded from such a serious choice? Charles finally stood, closed the folder between them, and answered with words that cut through every layer of ceremony. There were decisions he had to make, as king before husband. Camilla did not interrupt. She understood the meaning immediately. The man beside her had drawn a line between marriage and monarchy, and for the first time in this crisis, she knew exactly which side would win when the two collided. Camilla then asked whether the wording could still be softened. The king refused. Charles told her the declaration had already passed the point where he was prepared to reconsider it. Changing the language now would make the palace look uncertain at the very moment he was trying to remove uncertainty. She understood the logic, but that did not erase the wound. The queen consort had not lost her place beside him. Yet she had discovered there were limits to how far that place extended. William later learned about the clash through a private documented account passed through the household. The prince was deeply uncomfortable. He had never wanted his designation to become a weapon inside his father's marriage, and the thought that Charles and Camilla were now divided because of his new position made the title feel heavier than before. But his discomfort soon gave way to a darker realization. Their argument was only the visible conflict. Beneath it stood a colder question. When the king could not act alone, who would everyone now expect to command? That was where the true power of royal successor was about to reveal itself. Royal successor sounded ceremonial. Inside the palace, it was understood very differently. Those two words created a new expectation. When uncertainty struck, William would no longer be viewed merely as the heir waiting patiently behind his father. He would be treated as the man Charles had deliberately identified to carry royal authority forward. And the more William understood what his father had given him, the less the declaration felt like an honor, and the more it resembled an emergency instruction. William felt the change almost immediately. Senior advisors who had once carried sensitive questions straight to Charles began bringing him into conversations earlier, asking for his judgment before decisions reached the king. Within this dramatized account, a palace directive meant a formal instruction guiding how senior royal business should be handled. That mattered, because royal authority is not felt only through ceremonies or titles. It is felt through access, timing, and the quiet question of whose opinion is sought first. The prince now found himself moving closer to the center of that process. William refused to enjoy it. During his first major briefing after the declaration, an advisor congratulated him on the significance of his new position. The prince stopped the conversation immediately. He made it clear that nobody was to treat his father's decision as a victory over another member of the family. Charles was still king. William was still his son. And if the designation became a symbol of rivalry, then the future king believed it would damage the very stability his father was trying to protect. Charles watched that restraint carefully. The king saw his son accept greater responsibility without reaching for more than he had been given, and the reaction reassured him. Yet it also carried a painful truth. William was already behaving like someone who understood the burden of command. Charles had spent years preparing him slowly, but now the monarch could see how naturally the prince was stepping into the space the declaration had opened. Pride came with a shadow. Every sign that William was ready also reminded his father why readiness had suddenly become so important. Then came the second instruction. William was privately shown an additional written directive stating that if any sudden disruption affected the king's schedule, he was to be consulted before major household decisions moved forward. The prince read the wording carefully. It did not remove Charles from authority, but it placed William directly inside the chain of decision-making whenever uncertainty appeared. The emergency declaration was no longer symbolic. It had begun shaping procedure. Camilla noticed the same change from another direction. Queen Camilla learned that some future-facing briefings were now moving directly between Charles's office and William's team before reaching the wider household. The queen consort understood what that meant. Her access had not disappeared, but the flow of influence had changed, and the change was happening faster than anyone had expected. The first real test arrived almost at once. A major royal engagement was suddenly thrown into doubt. Conflicting recommendations reached the household, and Charles was not immediately available to settle them. For the first time, everyone looked toward William. The declaration had been words on paper until that moment. Now, two centers of authority were about to collide in real time. The first consequence arrived without ceremony. A royal engagement suddenly required restructuring. Senior staff disagreed over how to proceed, and Charles was unavailable for immediate consultation. For years, such a moment would have produced delay, while officials searched for the safest chain of command. This time, they turned to William. His answer came quickly. What happened next proved that the emergency declaration was already reshaping the monarchy, and showed Camilla that Charles's decision could be felt far beyond private family rooms. William listened as competing recommendations reached him almost at once. One group wanted the engagement postponed completely. Another believed the schedule could be reorganized without damaging the crown's public commitments. A royal engagement, in simple terms, is an official duty carried out by a working member of the family on behalf of the monarchy. That made the decision more than a diary problem. Canceling could signal uncertainty, while moving ahead badly could make the household look divided. The prince understood that whatever he chose would be read as the first practical test of the authority his father had just placed around him. William let the arguments finish before he spoke. The prince closed the briefing folder, paused, and authorized the revised arrangement. There was no triumph in his voice. He knew exactly why everyone had turned toward him, and that knowledge made the moment heavier. Charles had named him royal successor, and now those words were guiding behavior before the king himself could intervene. William had crossed an invisible line. For the first time, he was not merely being prepared to decide. He had decided. Camilla received the news in silence. Queen Camilla listened as an aide explained that the revised engagement had gone forward under William's instruction, then remained seated after the briefing ended. She slowly removed her glasses and said nothing for several seconds. The queen consort had feared the declaration would alter access and influence, but now the shift was real. The palace had not waited for Charles. It had moved through William, and the new chain of expectation was beginning to settle around everyone. Charles learned what had happened soon afterward. The king reviewed the decision and refused to reverse it. Instead, he sent William a short private message confirming that his son had acted exactly as expected. That message mattered because it removed any possibility that staff had overreached. The monarch himself was endorsing the new pattern. William was not taking authority from his father. Charles was deliberately teaching the household to trust his judgment when uncertainty struck. The change spread quickly. Senior staff began adjusting instinctively, including the prince earlier, and treating his response as a source of stability rather than a temporary substitute. Yet William remained troubled. Everyone else seemed to understand what his father's declaration meant, but the two men at its center had still never spoken plainly about what Charles truly expected from him. That silence had become impossible to carry. The prince finally asked his father to meet without aides, without files, and without the protection of royal language. This time, William wanted the truth. For all the meetings, declarations, arguments, and instructions, one conversation had still not happened. William had never asked Charles the simplest question directly: "What do you actually want me to do now?" When father and son finally met alone, there were no advisors to translate duty into careful language. There was only a king facing the limits of control and an heir refusing to misunderstand him. What Charles said transformed the declaration from a power move into something painfully human. William had watched everyone else interpret the meaning for him. Palace staff treated the designation as a strategic signal. Family members saw it through fear, loyalty, or wounded pride. But the prince knew none of those interpretations could answer the question that mattered most. An abdication, the formal act of a monarch voluntarily giving up the throne, was not what Charles had announced, yet the urgency around the decision had made people wonder how close the future had suddenly become. William needed to hear the truth from his father, without anyone standing between them. Charles agreed to meet alone. The king arrived without aides, briefing papers, or carefully prepared language, and that absence stripped the moment of its usual protection. William did not waste time. He told his father he could carry responsibility. He could absorb pressure. He could make difficult decisions. What he could not carry forever was uncertainty. Then the prince asked plainly, "Tell me what you need from me." Charles heard the question not as a challenge, but as the request of a son who was tired of guessing. The king finally answered what he had refused to explain at Windsor. Charles admitted that their earlier conversation had forced him to confront how dangerous ambiguity could become if something unexpected happened. He wanted everyone, from William to the household around them, to know there would be no hesitation over who must steady the monarchy next. The king was not preparing to disappear. He was preparing the institution to survive pressure without confusion, and he wanted his son to understand that before anyone else defined the declaration for him. William listened without interrupting. The prince had feared the designation might be a hidden farewell, a warning that his father was already stepping away. Charles rejected that idea completely. He told him the declaration was not surrender, retirement, or retreat. It was preparation. The monarch intended to continue reigning, but he also wanted William capable of acting decisively whenever circumstances demanded it. For the first time, the future king understood that his father had not pushed him forward because he was giving up. Charles had pushed him forward because he refused to leave the crown vulnerable. William accepted the burden, but not without a condition. He told Charles they would make this transition together. No courtier, family argument, or palace rivalry would be allowed to turn preparation into separation. The king agreed. For the first time since the emergency declaration, father and son were no longer standing on opposite sides of uncertainty. But beyond the palace, the words royal successor had already escaped into public view. What began as private preparation was about to become a national spectacle, and the country would give those two words meanings neither man had intended. By morning, the declaration no longer belonged to Charles or William. It belonged to everyone watching. Broadcasters repeated the phrase, royal successor. Newspapers turned it into a banner headline. Crowds began discussing whether Britain had witnessed a symbolic handover hidden inside an emergency announcement. Yet inside the palace, William looked less triumphant than ever. The public saw history accelerating. He saw the burden his father had deliberately placed in his hands. William watched the coverage with Catherine beside him, and the language unsettled him almost immediately. Commentators spoke of victory, transfer, and a future arriving early. A royal household statement, a formal message issued on behalf of the monarchy to explain or clarify an official position, tried to cool that interpretation by stressing continuity. Charles was still king. The existing structure of the crown had not been replaced. What had changed was confidence. The public now knew, in unmistakable terms, whom the monarch expected to carry responsibility forward when pressure came. Catherine, Princess of Wales, noticed how uncomfortable William became each time the declaration was described as a personal triumph. The prince told her he hated the idea that people might see his father's decision as one man gaining while another faded. She answered quietly that he could not control every headline or every argument. He could control only what he did next. William understood the point, but it did not remove the tension. The future king knew that every public gesture from this moment onward would be interpreted through the declaration. Charles faced the same storm from the opposite side. The king was handed the morning papers and studied the largest headline without speaking. One front page carried the blunt words, "Charles names William royal successor." After a long pause, the monarch remarked that the country had understood the seriousness of the announcement, even if it had misunderstood some of the emotion behind it. Charles had acted from fear of uncertainty, not from a desire to create spectacle. Yet spectacle was exactly what had followed. Outside Buckingham Palace, that spectacle became impossible to ignore. A crowd gathered near the gates as copies of the headline passed from hand to hand. Some people cheered when William's name was mentioned. Others simply stared at the unfamiliar phrase, trying to decide whether they were witnessing preparation, transition, or something even more dramatic. Broadcasters repeatedly returned to recent footage of Charles and his son appearing together, turning father and son into the defining public image of continuity. William saw the symbolism, and so did Charles. The prince understood that the declaration could now either harden into a story of replacement or become what his father had intended, a message of shared duty. The king reached the same conclusion. He decided speculation could not be allowed to write the final meaning of the moment. Charles wanted one last family gesture, not another explanation, not another carefully worded statement. He wanted an act that would make the relationship between king and heir unmistakable. The world had already given royal successor its own meaning. Now Charles and William would define it for themselves and bring the crisis to its emotional conclusion. In the end, the most important consequence of the declaration was not a new title, a headline, or a palace power struggle. It was the moment Charles stopped treating succession as a distant inevitability and began treating preparation as an act of love, duty, and survival. William had not replaced his father. Charles had not surrendered his crown. Instead, one king had looked directly at the future, named the man he trusted to protect it, and removed uncertainty before uncertainty could become crisis. Charles allowed the emergency declaration to stand exactly as intended. The king remained sovereign, the reigning monarch who still held the central authority of the crown, while William's royal successor designation became a clear signal that continuity had been prepared rather than improvised. That distinction mattered. The monarchy had not changed hands. It had changed its level of readiness. Palace staff who had spent days wondering where responsibility now rested began to understand that father and son were not competing for authority. They were operating inside the same plan. William felt that difference most clearly in one final private exchange. The prince met his father without ceremony, and Charles thanked him for never treating the declaration as a prize. The king had watched how carefully his son resisted triumph, how often he redirected attention back toward duty, and how determined he was not to turn preparation into rivalry. William answered with the simplest truth of the entire crisis. He had never wanted his father's crown. He only wanted to be ready when his father needed him. For Charles, that answer confirmed everything he had hoped the declaration would reveal. Camilla reached her own conclusion more slowly. Queen Camilla had begun this crisis feeling excluded, uncertain, and deeply unsettled by how quickly Charles had acted. But the queen consort now understood that the decision had not been designed to erase her influence or diminish her place beside him. It had been designed to secure the monarchy beyond any one person. Her earlier anger softened into reluctant acceptance because she finally recognized the fear beneath the king's urgency. Not fear of losing power, but fear of leaving confusion behind. Charles understood that succession itself had never been the real emergency. The line of inheritance had always been clear. The danger was hesitation. The monarch had feared what could happen if pressure arrived, and everyone inside the royal household paused to ask who should act, who should lead, and whose judgment should carry the greatest weight. By naming William openly, the king had removed that hesitation before it could become institutional weakness. William emerged changed by the burden, but not consumed by it. The future king had been given stronger authority, yet his refusal to exploit that authority became the clearest evidence that Charles had chosen wisely. Real power, William had learned, did not begin with possession. It began with restraint. The declaration ultimately strengthened rather than divided the crown. Charles remained king. William became the publicly affirmed guardian of what followed. Their uncertainty had been replaced by shared purpose. The emergency declaration had begun with fear, shaken a family, and forced hidden tensions into the open house. But it ended with something stronger than any title. A father certain of his son, a son prepared to carry his father's legacy, and a monarchy that finally knew exactly where its future stood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.